All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the hidden, honestly quite predictable, mechanisms that drive human migration all across the globe. Now, migration is pretty much as old as humanity itself, right? I mean, we've been on the move ever since Homo sapiens first spread out from Africa. But today, when you layer on modern political borders, complex refugee laws, and these massive interconnected global labor markets, this ancient human behavior takes on a completely new, incredibly fascinating structure. So let's start with a really relatable question. Why do people actually uproot their lives and leave one place to settle somewhere else? Almost all of us have some sort of personal or ancestral history of moving, so we kind of know what it feels like to seek out a new horizon. Whether that's for a better job or just a safer place to live. But what actually drives these decisions when we're talking about a massive global scale? To wrap our heads around all this, we're going to cover 5 main areas. First, the forces that move us. Second, how we categorize human migration. Third, the laws of migration. Fourth, the mobility transition. And finally, migration in the real world. Let's get right into it. Part 1, the forces that move us, and understanding the individual drivers of migration. Let's start right down at the micro level. Think about it. Nobody really packs up their entire life without experiencing a mix of both dissatisfaction at home and some perceived opportunities somewhere else. It's almost always a combination of what we call push and pull factors. Push factors are the things driving you away, like poverty, conflict, or environmental hazards. Pull factors are the things attracting you to a specific destination. Think higher wages, better schools, or political freedom. And here's the key. They operate simultaneously. These factors usually fall into 4 main buckets: economic, political, social, and environmental. Economically, picture a worker making $2 a day in rural Guatemala being pulled toward a $12 an hour agricultural job in California. That wage gap is an incredibly powerful magnet. Socially, there's this thing called chain migration. Once a Somali community, for example, establishes itself in Minneapolis, the social networks and cultural familiarity they build become a massive pull factor for new migrants. And environmentally, things are shifting fast. The World Bank actually projects up to 216 million internal climate migrants by 2050, as folks are pushed away by things like severe droughts and rising sea levels. Moving on to part 2, categorizing human migration and how geography and the law actually classify this movement. Legally speaking, the line between voluntary and forced migration is absolutely vital because it determines who gets legal protection. Forced migrants are fleeing violence or disasters with literally no safe alternative, while voluntary migrants are choosing to relocate for better conditions. But out in the real world, that line gets super blurry. If extreme poverty or devastating climate change makes choosing to stay a life-threatening option, is that really voluntary? The boundary becomes a very, very complex gray area. Then there's the geographic side of things. We constantly hear about international border crossings on the news, but the vast majority of human migration actually happens within a country's own borders. Globally, there are roughly 3.5 times as many internal migrants as there are international ones. Just to put that massive scale into perspective, China alone has seen an estimated 250 to 300 million rural workers pack up and move to cities since the 1980s. That is one of the largest human population movements in history, and it happened entirely internally. But when folks are actually forced to flee, crossing an international border or failing to cross one drastically changes their legal protections. A refugee has crossed a border and gets protection under the 1951 Convention, so they can't be sent back to danger. But an internally displaced person, or IDP, they're forced to flee for the exact same reasons, but because they haven't crossed a national border, they aren't covered by international refugee law. They have to rely on their own government for protection, which, tragically, is often the very government that displaced them in the first place. Section 3, the laws of migration, finding the hidden patterns in the chaos. Now, you might think millions of individual decisions would just look like pure chaos on a map. But back in 1885, a cartographer named Ernst George Ravenstein proved that's not the case. By crunching a ton of mid-Victorian census data, Ravenstein came up with these highly predictable, almost mathematical rules for human movement. He found that most migration happens over very short distances. He noticed that when people do travel far, they almost always head for major commercial and industrial cities. And crucially, he figured out that economics is the primary motive above absolutely everything else. These patterns are literally the foundation of how we study movement today. One of his coolest concepts is step migration. He realized people rarely jump straight from a remote rural farm directly to a totally different country. There are just too many obstacles: transit costs, language barriers, borders. Instead, they step their way up. They go from a village to a nearby market town, then maybe a regional city, stopping at the nearest place that offers a bit more opportunity before they ever attempt a big international leap. That brings us to part 4, the mobility transition and how migration changes as societies develop. Geographer Wilbur Zielinski proposed a model in 1971 showing that as a nation industrializes, the way its people move shifts right alongside its economy. So early on, as agriculture gets mechanized, you see massive waves of people moving from rural areas to cities. But fast forward to highly advanced societies, and those rural to urban moves are mostly done. Instead, the main flow becomes complex exchanges between different cities, and even a counter-migration, where city dwellers move out to rural areas for a better lifestyle. Finally, part 5, migration in the real world. Let's look at some actual case studies reshaping our globe today. Looking impartially at places like Colombia and Syria, we see massive, heartbreaking displacement that illustrates the reality of forced migration. In Colombia, decades of complex civil conflict created up to 8 million internally displaced persons, mostly rural folks pushed into cities. Over in Syria, the 2011 civil war displaced about 6 million people internally, but it also created 6 million cross-border refugees. It's a striking example of how the exact same type of crisis creates totally different legal categories of migrants, all dictated by the geographic accident of whether or not someone crossed a border. Now, if we pivot over to voluntary economic migration, the global labor movement has a wild impact. Take the Philippines, for example, which is one of the world's leading exporters of labor. A staggering 9 to 10% of their entire GDP is generated by remittances. That's money being sent back home by overseas workers. It's a massive, critical source of income that directly funds things like education and small businesses back home. But there's a catch here, a phenomenon known as brain waste or de-skilling. Because foreign wages can be so high, a highly trained, fully credentialed nurse in the Philippines might actually choose to move abroad to work as a domestic helper simply because it pays up to 5 times more. Economically speaking, for the individual, it is a perfectly rational choice that obeys Ravenstein's laws. But for the home country, it's a huge collective loss of talent and public investment. So, what's the big takeaway from all of this? Well, migration is not just a simple head count of people crossing lines on a map. It's a highly active geographic process. It is the ongoing dynamic redesign of our world's labor, capital, and culture at every single scale. From a tiny rural village to an entire remittance economy, all the way up to a global megacity. Knowing that human movement follows these incredibly predictable laws of push and pull, it makes you wonder what invisible forces are playing out in your own community right now. As climates change and global economies continue to shift, how will these geographic laws of migration reshape your neighborhood next? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.